Good evening, everybody. Is I, Nick, Pennsylvania. I'm here with my friend Brendan Bond, as ever. Evening, Brendan.
Evening, Nick. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing really good. It is a very ugly night out there. We are currently getting a wintry mix. It is threatening to freeze up on the roads, and I'm curious to see what my work is going to look like tomorrow. Having said that, I know there's a lot of places across America and Canada right now that are getting hammered. And we have thankfully been spared an overwhelming majority of that. We have had high winds all week, but have you lost any trees? Because I know you're in the woods over there.
Yeah, we've had a few branches come down, but honestly, no trees, knock on wood. And I keep looking at them just being like, it's only a matter of time, you know?
Yeah, it's been something. Well, hey, before we get into our discussion for the evening, we have a lot of kind of catching up. We've had quite a few comments. And we had some follow-up, some comments we got that we read last episode. So I'm going to hand it over to Bond for a few of these here.
Yeah, so like Nick, you just mentioned, I've had a lot of engagement over the last few weeks and everything, and just kind of wanted to following up on some of the stuff. And again, when you guys tell us stuff, we want to make sure that if it's okay with you, it goes out to other people, you know, because I think these are fun things to talk about, like you guys all think. So the first is around Jamie King, who we spoke with 2 episodes ago about the cast that he took out in the Shenango Reservoir. So we read some comments from, I believe, YouTube last week around that, and we said we're going to follow up with Jamie, and we did. And what Jamie said was, I think your listener was correct. It may have been better if I had trimmed the extra casting material. I'm not the best at casting, but it's still a large type of dog-like animal. I appreciate the comment. And we talked a little bit more about that, about best practices, and like we've said, and I think Jamie said whenever he was on, we're all still learning. So that kind of constructive criticism to helps us all get better, because we all want the best information, right?
Yeah, and as Jamie said, and as you reiterated when I was reading the comment, he's pretty open about the fact that this isn't his normal bag. He's very much
right.
The Bigfoot thing. So because the same commenter, King Flippy Nips, had also said something about the size of the print itself not being especially exceptional in his mind. So there's that too. So I agree, but I'm still curious to hear what other feedback the Kings receive by other people who are looking at this casting that they've taken. But we had quite a bit of engagement too with our most recent episode about the Green Kids, certainly our oldest episode or topical episode to date.
Right. And like you mentioned, we got a good bit of feedback around this. Some of it was on one side, which was my one friend texting me and just saying the kids were sick, end of story, which again, I appreciate, but I'm like, I wonder if there's maybe a little bit more. We did get some more lengthy, still well thought out, but lengthy feedback from 2 folks. So I wanted to read kind of 3 points that Bowie brought up. And this was us kind of talking and going back and forth on this and everything. So if this seems a little conversational, that's why. She says, number 1, I think that the caves are interesting. When you're dealing with fairy folklore or the dead, there's plenty of subterranean motifs coming out of the hills or the mountains, as all of these areas are portals to the other world. You also have a lot of abduction accounts where people claim the area was lit up but couldn't account for the source of light. Might the perpetual twilight be more in line with these fairy worlds than our actual sun? On the mundane side, we could argue bioluminescence and suppose they lived in a deeply shaded area, but wouldn't we have found and made note of such a large area by now? ? It was large enough to contain a town and pastures for sheep. Number 2, the color. Fava beans or broad beans, the only food they would originally accept, can lead to a jaundiced coloration, which I think you mentioned at the time, Nick, which I hadn't heard of. And then
I don't know if I said fava beans in particular, but I think I did say something about some sort of food. And just a quick comment, I wonder if the sheep in this mystical land were of a different hue.
She actually brought that up too, and I'm like, that's a great point. And they don't say so, but that's one of the things I just wish we had more information on. But she went on to say it would make sense that in an isolated population, a genetic mutation like this could be prevalent, along with a corrupted dialect that didn't match its parent language that scholars would be familiar with.
I agree with that because, again, just before I came up here, we were watching videos of Newfoundland speakers and speakers from Tangier Island and Boston Brahmins, because of
Right.
course I love dialects and accents and whatnot. So I can buy into that. However, genetic mutation I'm not buying, only because a genetic mutation wouldn't be remedied in such a short time with one sample, with just a change in diet. So
Yeah, unless it was like a reaction or something that was then no longer present. I mean, yeah, it's like, again, that's why this is so frustrating, is none of the answers are good, you know?
yeah.
And then just one more point. She brought up that St. Martin's, it should have been simple enough to send a message to that city once she had told them that, and to confirm if anyone was missing their children. And why didn't she ever give the full city name? This is one aspect where the mundane explanation is very frustrating. I completely agree. The idea of an otherworld St. Martin's is very appealing. Otherwise, we would believe that no one ever sent a courier, especially after she'd married up and could probably afford it. And also, the city was nothing like her description, which I suppose might be accounted for if they were farmers living far from the city, but consider themselves part of that territory, which I thought was an excellent point as well.
I agree with that. I agree with that, and I would add too that we kind of close with my coming to the conclusion that there is certainly so much more to the story that was, even if it were written down, it has been lost to the ages. So for all we know, that did happen, and there is a complete resolution to this story that we will quite likely never know.
Right. And then one more comment from Arthur, who has always been really engaged and really appreciate his time and thoughts. He said about the episode, I mean, there are two issues I'd raise. The first is, if the kids were Flemish, the general population, so as stories tell me, would have been able to recognize that language. Not necessarily understand it, but recognize it. And that increases as the kids are taken higher up the social scale. Flemish wasn't some weird exotic language the English population hadn't encountered before. Post 1066, it would have been something they'd be well used to. Second part is the greenness. If we're saying that it was due to malnutrition, etc., would that be their most notable feature? My understanding is that most green you can get through malnutrition is kind of a jaundice, where you're almost more yellow than green. But still, my mom used to be a childminder, and she often looked after newborn babies who were jaundiced, but you'd never call them yellow. Ditto, as I've grown older and know drinkers whose livers have packed up, these kids didn't have a tinge of green. These kids just didn't have a tinge of green. They were green. And that's not malnutrition. That's something much weirder. Anyways, thank you. I always enjoy your discussion of these issues.
Well, I always enjoy Arthur's comments because that's pretty well thought out, and I'm in agreement with him. I mean, 1066 is the Norman conquest, and most people that know anything about the English language know, and English politics know, that that is a pivotal year in the Anglosphere, the Norman conquest. I think he's right in saying that Flemish would not have been unrecognizable, even if it weren't understood by everybody, especially, as Arthur noted, as they were brought to the attention of more and more people that had more exposure, likely, and more experiences. And as you were presenting the story, I'm reminded you had said something about an influx of Flemish-speaking peoples into Eastern England itself. And, so yeah, no, I think those are, I received those comments very well. I don't know if you had any additional thoughts regarding Arthur's comments.
Again, I think Arthur and Bowie brought up fantastic points as usual.
Completely agree. Chris, our friend, had sent something in as well. He said, really enjoyed it, though a bit normal. He says, like you guys said, I think most of it can be described in the context of 12th century England. I guess green is an objective observation and probably quite exaggerated over time. Interestingly, I'd be interested to see if any genealogy of this young lady could be brought forward, given how small England is, and the tendency of people to not stray far from where they were born. There could be relatives generations after, and in fact, I mean, likely so, because we know when they found the bones of King Richard III underneath a parking lot,
Mm-hmm.
they were able to find direct ancestors. And that's how
Right.
they were able to confirm, and also able to confirm, too, that King Richard III had scoliosis, pretty significant scoliosis, if I remember correctly. And there was one more comment we got from Jared. It says, there's a simple explanation for the green children. Reptilians, they walk among us and everyone knows us. I will say one thing.
Yeah.
I will say one thing about the color. And this is touching upon what Arthur said. You know, he's seen jaundiced kids and he would never describe them as yellow. And it's important to remember, too, our concept of colors and language has evolved quite a lot over the hundreds of years. So I do wonder if there's something lost in translation there as well. I mean, we still say you look green sickly. I would never say, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah,
Am I wrong?
Yeah.
But you would never, when I've heard that expression so many times, and I've even had people tell me you look a bit green.
Right.
I've never looked at myself and thought, I've said, I look pale.
Right.
I look flush, not green. So could that be a holdover to an older expression? That was something else I've wondered about since we last spoke.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Two quick things. One, I think the genealogy thing that Chris brought up is an excellent point. And I wonder if anyone has done any. I mean, with how big genealogy is these days, I would just love to know if someone's actually done that work. But again, as someone who's not into that world, I have no idea how small or big of an ask that is.
I do wonder. But speaking of complete resolutions, which we will likely never know, now, most Americans, and therefore a good chunk of the English-speaking world, is well aware of my fascination with D.B. Cooper. So, now, I reached out to you earlier because apparently, within the last year, there has been some new happenings within the field of amateur D.B. Cooper research because, as you know, around 2016, the Federal Bureau of Investigations closed the D.B. Cooper case, and I feel that they concluded with something along the lines that he most likely died that night or shortly thereafter, and I'm inclined to concede that that is entirely possible. However, there's so much more information. So we're going to get into talking about a couple of the suspects plus this new information and what it says. There are so many great and in-depth documentaries of the subject, though. So we're going to go to Bond in the Boeing 727, I believe it is, at an altitude of 10,000 feet and get the 10,000-foot rundown of the series of events that are now collectively known as the D.B. Cooper skyjacking incident.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those, like you mentioned, Nick. It's one of those stories that just kind of, it's kind of like modern folklore in the sense that there is just so much that's grown out of it. And even after the FBI has said, like, you know what, here's probably what happened, it's so not a resolution that we feel comfortable with, even though, like you said, probably the most likely outcome. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the D.B. Cooper case or have only ever just heard of it kind of in passing, wanted to give you just like Nick said, a 10,000-foot view of the story. On November 24th, 1979, Northwest Orient Flight 307, like you mentioned, Nick, it was a Boeing 727, was going to Seattle from Portland. There were 43 passengers, and it was a short flight, about a half an hour, I think. Along with everybody else, a anonymous-looking businessman boarded the flight and used the name Dan Cooper when signing in. Obviously, this is before TSA was really a thing, so security on flights like this was really not what we would expect them to look like today. So the gentleman sat near the back of the plane, orders a 7-Up and bourbon, which is kind of a interesting drink, I think, even nowadays. That's pretty specific.
I'm into it. I think there was actually, I'll tell you what, I think I've seen old adverts for 7 Up, and that was one of the things they recommend,
Oh,
if I
really?
recall correctly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've seen this for Canada Dry, I can assure you.
ooh, yeah, no, Canada Dry. Yeah, sign me up. But so after the flight is up in the air and everything, the gentleman passes a note to one of the flight attendants. I think it was Florence, I think. But she didn't read it right away. And he kind of like gets her attention, is like, read the note. And the note says something to the effect of him having a bomb in his suitcase that he had with him. And she, of course, takes the note and the demands to the pilot. What the pilot then relays that they're being hijacked or skyjacked, and this person is demanding $200,000 for parachutes, a fuel truck to refuel the plane, and it seems like food for the crew, which is actually pretty thoughtful, all things considered. So they call it in, and they end up landing, and he exchanges the passengers for the money and the parachutes, and tells the crew, "We're going to Mexico." So they head south from Seattle towards Mexico. They think around 8:13 p.m. the aft stairs, which aft stairs are like stairs coming down almost like straight down the tail of the airplane, which you don't really see much anymore, but like that was a common way of getting into planes back then. He lowers that while they're at 10,000 feet, and they think the pilots say they felt like a bump or whatever, an oscillation or something. At 8:13, that's where they think he jumped at that time, which was right over a place called Ariel, Washington. Now, that town takes their DB Cooper very seriously and has like, there's a whole like cottage tourist industry just around it being the place where DB Cooper apparently jumped out. Now, where he jumped out is kind of in one of the many elements of this case that are up for discussion. They think he jumped at 8:13. It may have been much later because of two kind of, at the time, things that were very curious about the case. One, a few miles away from that, there was actually in the 1980s money that was serialized for DB Cooper found near a lake.
Yes, it was actually found by the Columbia River.
Yes.
It was found in 1980. It was roughly $5,800, found by an 8 or 9-year-old boy who actually was able to maintain some of that money because he sold some in 2006 or 2008 for a tidy sum.
I bet.
And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that money later on, but yes, you are correct.
Yeah, and then so that's a place that's a little different from Ariel, and also people also think that he may have jumped out near Reno, Nevada. Oh, it was a Reno newspaper that got a letter from someone named DB Cooper using letters cut out from the Sacramento newspaper, and it said, "Thanks for the hospitality, signed DB Cooper," which this was a few days later, so it could have been fake, could have not been. No one's entirely sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's fake only because the guy, as you know, signed in as Dan Cooper, but whatever.
Right. Yeah. So that's one of the big early on things that kind of was a mystery to people. Now, when people get into figuring out like who this guy was, some of the early things that I think are worth mentioning was there were cigarettes that he smoked on the plane, but those had, I believe, since been lost. So they were lost before they could ever do. They were probably before DNA testing was really a serious or accurate thing. Yeah.
We're talking 1971. Yeah, they were 8 Raleigh brand cigarettes.
Yeah. And also, he left his tie on board, which was this JCPenney clip-on tie, like nothing terribly fancy. But in recent years, that has been tested, and they found like rare earth metals on it, which
I'm going to talk about.
Okay,
that.
cool. Yeah.
Yep.
So I'll let you talk about that. But that's one of like the big things in the last few years, I guess. But the FBI interviewed thousands of people based off of a sketch. You guys, everyone's probably seen the sketch, but if not, look it up. The sketch looks pretty cool. Like he has like sunglasses on,
sure
back
does.
hair. Like he looks pretty. It's pretty spycraft stuff.
He looks like he was the inspiration for a lot of the two-tone stuff that came out of England in the early 80s.
Yes, that's absolutely
like, he
true.
could have been like the next member of Madness or the Specials for all
right.
we know.
If you told me DB Cooper played piano in the Specials, I'd be like, oh yeah,
yeah, of course he did. I mean, second only to the Unabomber, it's probably the most well-known police sketch of all time.
Right. So that's absolutely worth looking up. But so the FBI looked at tons of leads, people calling them in all over the place, especially early on. This was like a huge manhunt. And probably, I mean, probably the biggest one at that time, or at least anywhere near that, you'd think. Then it kind of like not like fizzles, but like that's there's not a ton more evidence from the contemporary time. It was really seen as a huge mystery, and you have people thinking he was someone who was in the military because he knew to go on that kind of plane. There's people who think he wasn't military because of, A, B, or C. It's just like Nick mentioned, there are dozens of excellent books out there that go very in depth into it. And like we say with a lot of folklore, when you look at it at first, like, oh, this seems pretty simple. Then the more you dig, it just gets weirder and deeper and weirder.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree because there have been a number of very popular suspects, and they all have a lot of really solid merit to them. From most of them having skydiving experience. One who's been, I think, thoroughly debunked was a smoke diver, or one of those firefighters, forest firefighters, and what had that experience. And a lot of these guys look remarkably like the sketch, remarkably so. And the other issue is I've heard people debunking or trying to debunk based off the sketch. Well, they say, well, this guy, who I'm going to be talking about later, his ears stick out. And I think that anybody that would be working with a police sketch artist would have noted the ears. Well, maybe not. Let me ask you this. Do you notice what color people's eyes are?
No.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Because who wants to be that? I'd feel weird if you were so, like, you read those little pins that say, if you can read this, you're too close. If you can see the color of my eyes, you're closer than I want you to be, quite likely.
Right. Or you're just really familiar with somebody. Like you would never notice it in passing,
Bingo.
Like unless someone had like very striking, like if that was like their main feature, we're like, oh, that person's eyes, holy crap.
And if I were scared because someone told me they had a bomb on this plane,
right,
I'm probably not going to think to get their eye color.
Right. And how many times and we're going to say this a lot, but like when it comes to eyewitness testimony, that's like what that's all
right.
So here goes for his big O card. Yep.
So I'm gonna try to stay somewhat on a path here, but odds are, because I'm staring at like 80 different things right now, odds are I might lose that. So I hope you can all stay with me. I hope I don't get too scattered here, but there's a complete resolution to the DB Cooper thing that we're probably never going to know.
Right. Much like the Green Children. Yep.
I'm just gonna put my own belief out there, and that is I do believe the person did have some military experience because he specifically ordered the plane be below 10,000 feet. Why? Pressurization. 2, he demanded that parts, I forget if it's the ailerons or something that slows the plane down.
Yeah. The flaps
that they were put at exactly 15 degrees because the plane would have to stay under 200 miles an hour with those on, apparently. So we know that the plane was flying just below 10,000 feet. The plane speed was around 170 knots, and I've crunched numbers, that's about 196 miles per hour, or 315 kilometers per hour. The air temperature at that height is estimated to be around minus 6 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 21 degrees Celsius. Because of the wind speed, the air temperature would bring that down to around minus 69 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 56 degrees Celsius. That can't be right, my Celsius calculation there. But trust me on the Fahrenheit, I'm much more comfortable with that system. Now, that I've said that, I believe that is probably more than likely that the person died that night in the jump. Bold. I approve of it. I hope everybody on the plane was excited to go to Mexico and was disappointed when their new friend wasn't there. But the other reason why I say that isn't just because of some of those factors that I read there, because we know people have dove from that height and in similar conditions. My reason is purely upon The money, they had it copied. They mimeographed it, I think is the correct term, so that they would have, they were able to quickly have a record of the serial numbers.
Right.
Outside of the just shy of $6,000 that young boy found in 1980, there has never been a documented case of another one of those $20 bills coming up anywhere. And we're talking about one, I mean, they published in newspapers the serial numbers. Okay?
Right.
So that, coupled with like the package of money weighed about 22 pounds. I did not calculate that for the rest of the world. You'll have to do that on your own. But not a huge weight, not a huge burden that you're going to unload 6,000 or more of that just so you can hoof it down to the next town. So I don't buy that. So that's where I'm laying. I'm saying he died. But there are a few really interesting figures. Now, in his book, Into the Blast, Robert Blevins postulates a Kenneth P. Christensen. Okay? And there's some interesting reasons why. Let me pull up and I'll read for you just a few snippets, okay? Based in interviews that Blevins has given. So this Kenneth Christensen was a former Northwest Airlines employee who was never a suspect. But because of Blevins been digging into him for a long time, and some family members too believe that he was likely D.B. Cooper. Blevins is quoted as saying, "I would say I'm 90% to 95% certain that he was D.B. Cooper. He worked for the airline. He had paratrooper training. He had the opportunity. He had a lot of unexplained spending within a few months after the hijacking. He lent his best friend's sister $5,000 in cash to buy a house. Then he used another $16,000 to buy another house for himself. As far as we can tell, Kenny Christensen had one life before the hijacking and a completely different one afterwards." Okay? So, interesting. Blevins also states, and this is another quote, "The parachute that D.B. Cooper actually jumped with is called a Navy Backpack 6, and it's a smaller parachute, more of a military type. The skyjacker was a pretty tough guy, and Kenny went through paratrooper training where it started with 262 men and ended with 80 that actually finished, and he was one of them. I think that if he jumped out of the back of that 727, hit the ground, popped off his parachute, disconnected the harness and the container from it, buried the silk part, and put his briefcase and money bag into the container for the parachute, put it on his back, and walked out of the woods." Now, there's much more to this Kenneth P. Christensen. So you look him up. He ended up buying a cabin right around Tacoma with, and he paid cash. That cabin, I don't believe it's there anymore, but it was a print shop just a few years ago. And Blevins was involved in investigating that. They actually found in the attic under some insulation, there was a little trap door that held a little, not a room, but like a dresser drawer sized storage facility. There was nothing in there. There are claims that an earlier owner of the cabin, before the print shop was there are claims that money was found on the property, but that has not been able to be substantiated. Now, if you look up this fellow's picture, again, looks remarkably like him. It is said too, because this fellow is bald, that he wore a toupee, but he was not seen wearing the toupee. This is hearsay. He was not seen wearing the toupee after the skyjacking incident. So, it is suspicious how much money he ended up having, because we know how much he made and everything. It's an interesting one, and he's a local guy, and he worked paratrooper training and worked for the airport, so very interesting. For me, One of the most interesting people is Richard Floyd McCoy. I would put him at number 2 on the suspects. Now, are you familiar with this cat?
I've heard the name. I saw in one documentary a while ago. He was one of the, again, top mentions. So
Yeah. And there's good reason for that. He's an interesting character. I've heard people okay, first off, he would have been 29 or 30 when the DB Cooper incident took place. And because the eyewitnesses described DB Cooper as being in his 40s or possibly 50s, he was dismissed. That was one of the reasons, which I don't buy, because he looks, I mean, there's something about older photos where a lot of people who are my age or younger look older than me. Me. But here's a big part of the reason why Richard Floyd McCoy is commonly regarded. I mean, not only did he do 2 years in the Army, okay, he served in Vietnam. He was I believe he was a helicopter pilot. He got a Purple Heart in '64. He was a demolitions person, apparently, as well. And let me see where else I'm like I said, I'm trying to stay on a thing here. But about 6 months after, 5 to 6 months after the DB Cooper incident, McCoy, on April 7, 1972, pulled a very similar stunt. He had a fake hand grenade on him, plus a gun. Very similar modus operandi. He eventually got $500,000 in cash. I think it was when they were refueling in Colorado, and he would jump. Okay? He was caught pretty quick. A 16-year-old kid picked him up. He managed to walk his way to a diner where he got a burger, and he got a ride home to his own house from a 16-year-old kid.
Jeez.
So the FBI found him, and in his house he had a duffel bag with $499,970 on it in the duffel bag. Right. Pretty incriminating. He claimed he was innocent. I would love to know how he talked his way out of that.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't talk his way out, but I want to know what his line was. He actually was imprisoned not crazy far from us. We are in northwestern Pennsylvania over here. He was imprisoned in Lewisburg, which is over by Williamsport area. It's not far from 80. There is an exit on 80 for Lewisburg. He ended up breaking out of there with some accomplices. He was later killed in a shootout with FBI agents at Virginia Beach, November 1974.
I had never heard that before. That's wild. Okay.
Yeah. Now, one of the things here, though, is he a copycat? Very similar MO, but there's a few things that I think are credible. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. Some people have said, well, maybe the initial incident in Portland, Seattle area, maybe he did that to throw people off. And I could buy that. But I've heard some people say you couldn't smoke that many cigarettes if you never smoked in nuggets. I don't buy that.
Yeah.
That's, I think, silly. But his picture was shown to the flight attendants and other personnel on the DB Cooper flight, and they said that he was not the man that they remembered. And again, this is only, this is April. DB Cooper was in November.
Right.
Okay? So this isn't a crazy span of time between. So I might give credit that he's not, but again, a very interesting figure, and I think worth looking deeper into. And it's a real shame. It's a real shame that the cigarettes have been lost. However, I do believe that the FBI was trying to get, at some point, the DNA evidence from McCoy's family. Apparently his wife was very involved in planning the first incident Which, why couldn't she pick him up? Why couldn't, if
Right.
he got
You're
himself
planning
to
all
where
this
there was a
stuff.
phone, give
Yeah.
a call and be like, hey, I broke down. Say it
Yeah,
loud.
the
Give
chipmunk
yourself
has
an alibi.
pneumonia or whatever the
Yeah.
code word. Yeah.
He was not far from Provo, Utah, is my understanding, where he was living, because, again, 16-year-old kid gave him a ride back to his house.
That's okay. Yeah, that's a really good point. That seems like poor.
So
That's
Kenneth,
one of the things that doesn't match. Yeah.
yeah, so Kenneth P. Christensen is really interesting. Coincidentally, bourbon's a favorite drink of his, and he smoked Raleighs. And Richard Floyd McCoy, supremely interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you started to mention, the Cooper tie had been analyzed not too long ago. And what they found in that was so not just, it wasn't rare metal, it was an alloy, is my understanding. Let me cut down to this. So the skinny black clip-on tie had particles, I'm reading now from the Pittsburgh City paper, had particles of a type of metal made with titanium and stainless steel. Okay? It was braided into the titanium, the steel was. It was made at one place in the world.
At that time, really.
And that was not too far, about 45 minutes to an hour from us in Midland, Pennsylvania.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Are you familiar with Midland?
Yeah, I've been through there. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So Midland is over in Beaver County.
Mhm.
It is not far from where I used to teach at a high school. So I knew a lot of people that lived in Midland. Yes,
Mhm.
there was a plant that operated from 1911 until the 1980s. And yeah, it was the only place that made this. They had significant Boeing contracts in the 1960s. There is an amateur D.B. Cooper detective, Euless, who is saying that there is a person by the name of Vince Peterson. He can place him in Seattle. He can put him at Boeing. And he is a Pittsburgh guy. And of course, the Pittsburgh City paper has really run with this. All about Yins getting hijacked. So that's kind of the new thing.
Yeah.
However, yeah, pretty interesting. It should be noted, too, that when interviewed, the people who were on the plane, the staff and everything, said that he spoke with a slightly Midwestern accent.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to dig too much into this Vince Peterson. He worked at Rem Crew Titanium, where he was an engineer, but Pittsburgh is the gateway to the Midwest in many ways.
As we said, yeah.
It's just a really interesting turn, because if this is to be believed, then these are pretty rare. However, I don't think they exonerate some of our other suspects, only because if they were working at Boeing in some capacity where they would have been in contact with these metals, could they not have gotten on their tie? I don't
Right.
that, and I would hope an engineer wouldn't wear a clip-on tie.
You would hope, but I think that, like, because what I remember from a few years ago, I think this is definitely before the braided titanium that you just kind of mentioned was figured out from the particles that were on the tie. I remember hearing on a documentary, this was years ago, that some of the particles they thought were these rare earth metals that at the time would have matched up with folks who were involved with the construction of cathode ray tubes, which everything from televisions to early computers,
Right. Anything with a screen.
Right. Yeah. So at that point, it would have been, that would not have narrowed things down, because there's probably, thousands of places in the country.
No, the town of Emporium, north of us, was essentially built around two industries: small airplanes and thermionic valves, vacuum tubes, cathode ray tubes, and such. So again, every suspect that's stuck around this long is imperfect, right? I think if you look at anything long enough, you find flaws. Like, have you ever been staring in the mirror and realized how weird your lobes were, and then it was all you could think about the day?
Stuff like that, yeah. You almost
doesn't make him any less there, right? Okay,
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm inclined again, more than anything else. Like, if this first cat, this Christensen, was spending that much money, any era, you pay for something $16,000 in cash.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine someone's checking those bills, right? I'm
Right.
curious as to what you think.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the fact that the money has never showed up in circulation, especially around big purchases like that, that's going through banks, those banks are going through like the federal system and everything. That's a big, big red flag to me. Because that tells me one of two things. One, like you mentioned, it is sitting at the bottom of a lake right now. It is just gone. Or he got out of the country, but even if he got out of the country and went somewhere else and exchanged it, you think that money would show up on it would show up it would show up somewhere. That's too many bills for it not to show up somewhere.
People are looking.
Right, and people are looking, absolutely. So I think that's a big problem for me. Now, that being said, like I saw online someone postulating that maybe this was someone who is like the money didn't matter, maybe. Like maybe it was just like a thrill thing. Maybe it was someone who was having a mental health crisis who maybe once he realized it was happening, realized there was no way out of it except to jump out the back of the plane kind of thing. Now, hearing the Pittsburgh connection, I love the idea of someone strapping on a military parachute and trying to hop out the back of the plane and like quietly saying to themselves that the steps are slippy as they're getting out.
I would love that.
I'd love to hear that.
And the motivation they give for this engineer is because Pittsburgh area, Midland is not in Pittsburgh, but is part of the greater Pittsburgh metropolitan region.
Right.
Anywhere along the rivers here, we're steel.
Right.
Almost without exception.
Mhm.
There's still an operating steel mill less than 3 miles from my house right now.
Right.
Okay? If you've never watched The Deer Hunter, that's a pretty accurate description of Pittsburgh at the time.
It really
the surrounding areas.
It really is. That's a class. Oh, such a good movie.
Right. There was a lot of layoffs. It was a pretty heavy time. So yeah, that's the era we're talking about right now.
And
so Deer Hunter's a movie. Slapshot is a movie, but that was a reality for a lot of people.
Right. It's not that far off. It's not.
Right.
And I think too, like the idea of someone taking the money, like if you had someone who was coming from a downtrodden area and everyone's living, by their teeth, and suddenly someone comes into $200,000, like, especially, I'm sure this is the case everywhere, but like people talk.
Absolutely.
And that's not just a Pittsburgh thing. People talk. So that would get around pretty quick. Bad gas travels fast in a town, And I think that if it was someone who was trying to play Robin Hood, again, people would talk. Rightly or wrongly, someone's going to have a few too many Yinlings or Iron Cities and start talking about how Pete gave him $20,000 to save the farm.
Yeah, all I know is if I came into that much money, I wouldn't be buying Augustiners.
unless you're feeling nostalgic. Yeah.
What is it? There's 4, I think it's 3 or 4 Pittsburgh beers that are all the exact same beer, but in a different package.
Yeah.
It's Augustiner, Old German. What else?
Isn't this the same as the new Duquesne is?
I think you may be on there.
And there's maybe one other. Because for a long time, Evil Eye was just Iron City. It was.
I had no idea.
Yeah, don't tell anybody.
I never drank Iron City.
Oh, that's my grandfather worked at the Iron City Brewery for the whole time he was over here in America. So
I did drink Augustiner quite a bit.
Yeah, it's
not a proud man.
not a proud man, but no, but this is the area we're talking about. If it's from this, and what we're saying about around Pittsburgh would probably be similar culturally in any of the Rust Belt cities or anywhere near those places.
I would agree with that.
And I just don't like again, I think people talk. I think that if it was someone who made it out, somebody would have said something. And I don't even think that them skipping out of the country would have solved the problem of the serial numbers being known. If this would have been 30 years prior, sure. Yeah, you can just skip to an island and you're gone, but not in 1971.
Not in 1971. Not in the golden age of skyjacking.
Right.
Not
that was
with the FBI on you.
Right.
I mean, look how quickly they got McCoy, right?
Right.
So it's just that's what I'm getting down at. And that's everything I you want him to get away. It's so bold.
There's-
it's so daring. There's a part of you that wants him to get away, and I think that's what keeps this romantic notion alive.
Right. It's that whole outlaw versus criminal thing.
It's those three guys that the fact that they were able to get out of Alcatraz at all.
Right.
Even though they were almost certainly swept to sea.
Right. And that
You want them.
And again, let me just to like call a spade. DB Cooper still committed a crime and at the very least traumatized the hell out of the crew and passengers,
Sure.
So like I don't want to compare him to Robin Hood, kind of thing. This is not.
In fairness, he did get them dinner.
He did get him dinner,
and
which again,
promised a trip to Mexico.
But that's why the guy who also did the skyjackings doesn't line up for me, because I can't imagine someone who would think ahead enough to be like, you know what, I need to keep these people at least healthy, and show them like that they're not in imminent danger. Like we're trying to all get through this. That doesn't line up with someone having a fake grenade. That's a very different.
Well, again, DB Cooper had the briefcase that had the fake bomb in it, or at least it's postulated that it was fake.
Right, exactly.
So, and I didn't look deep to verify whether McCoy had offered sandwiches.
That's
okay. So I still think it's a very similar MO.
Yeah,
and,
you're right.
That's a
good point.
If any of these cats were Dan Cooper, my personal feeling is it was McCoy. However, the people who were on the plane with Dan Cooper saw the face and they said it wasn't. Okay. I'm going back to I think Dan Cooper died. The one reason why I do kind of hold out for McCoy though is because he was dead within a couple of years.
Right.
Which means that solves to me part of the money issue, and why that money was never circulated.
That makes a lot of sense. For my 2 cents, I like the idea that it was someone who was having a mental health crisis, or someone who's just like off their rocker, and like the money wasn't the thing. It's kind of, again, you know what? I'm saying that because of the movie The Dark Knight and the Joker with the money. That's where I'm getting that from.
Yeah, I've not seen it, but
top three movies. But that's what I like to think of. But that's also like the more romantic version, is like now you have someone who's having a moral quandary halfway through becoming conscious of what they're doing, versus someone who
you've
did a bad
exhausted the facts. The only thing left is romance.